Let's give it a listen.
You know, he's in touch with this feminine side.
I go to headphones here for detail.
Leaving a trail of deception and lies. Sure, he's myopic, but he's fun and psychotic. Left me unhinged.
Okay, so next step, we get these drums, we don't have room tones. Now we have ambience from the snare and kick samples that you can hear in there, which is great. But this was recorded in a tiny room with very few mics. So let's make our drums sound bigger. So let's have a quick listen to our snare samples first and see what we got. And you'll see why in a minute. That's pretty ringy snare with no verb on it. That's got a lot of verb, and it's also very EQ'd sounding, very mid-rangey. It's got some good ambience on it. I'm going to leave it as it is. So I'm going to go back to this snare here, which has no ambience. This is what I'm going to do. So I'm now going to create a snare reverb. So in Pro Tools, not sure what your DAW is, but in Pro Tools, Shift, Command, N is new. Command, arrow button to the right is selecting a stereo, and then up and down, auxiliary. So you can obviously do that by just clicking on it. I just like the quick keys. So now I've created a stereo auxiliary channel. I'm going to call it Snare Verb. Again, I'm pedantic. You don't have to be, but I am. I could do one of two things. I could actually send it from my existing bus, but that's a mono bus. So let's create a new bus. We'll go to a stereo bus. Let's go to 5 and 6. So let's input on 5 and 6 here. I'm going to put this in solo safe. So whenever I solo this track that's going to it, I will hear. So solo safe is Command, or Apple for the old Apple users, Command, and then you click on the solo and it will grey it out. See, it grays it out. That again is just a tip for guys that are using Pro Tools. Okay, so I'm going to select my reverb. Now, a couple of things. I'm going to select my reverb on the second channel. You'll see why in a second, because I may want to compress the signal going in. Let's just use good old-fashioned cheapy comes free reverb. Okay, I'm going to go to a room, medium size, and that gives me 750 milliseconds. As you may or may not know, if you've been watching a lot of my videos, which I assume you have, I used to have a drum room which had about a three-quarter of a second decay. So I'm used to that. This is not a ballad. It's kind of a mid-up tempo, but it's not super, super slow. It's mid-up tempo. It's 65, but it's like, well, you've heard the track. If you've listened beforehand and listened to the rough, you'll know it's a pretty massive rock song. And it gets chaotic in it. I don't want to have a massively long reverb. Now, don't get me wrong, you could have different reverbs for different sections of the song. But let's just find a generic one-size-fits-all for the time being, and it's a 3/4 millisecond. So let's have a listen to what we got. It's pretty cool. Okay, so a couple of things. The snare is turned down quite considerably to blend with the live snare. So the unfortunate thing about that is I'm not sending that much signal. So I could gain beforehand, but what I might actually do is put some compression on it. So I'm going to go back to 1176. 1176s are fixed threshold compressors. So what that means is to get more compression, you just turn the input up. Here's where your threshold's set, and so until you turn the gain up, it doesn't start to compress. And then when it goes past that point, depending on what your ratio is set to, it will compress more and more. So let's turn it up. So it's giving us more level. It's also just compressing the first transient just a little bit. I kind of like it. It's letting these are fast compressors, but they're not as fast as modern compressors. So it's letting a little pat, pat go through. That gives me a little bit more aggression on my snare. So, okay, but the proof of the pudding is how does it sound in the track? So let's get all of the sounds together. Starting again from the top. Without. With. I like that. Pretty well balanced. Now, you might ask, why do I use a sample? Well, first of all, I started from Andy Wallace. In the mid-90s, he mixed a record that I was a musician on, and he was triggering samples in those days. I don't remember, I think from a Huart. I don't honestly remember. But anyway, he was triggering samples through the SSL, and he used the sample and used that to trigger, I think, an SPX 90. Anyway, whatever it was either a lexicon, like a PCM 70 or PCM 80. It was that, or the Yamaha SPX 90, and he just triggered it from the sample. And the reason why? Well, it's cleaner. You don't get all that bleed from the cymbals and everything, and it just gives us more control. Sometimes, and quite often, I will use a sample just to trigger the verb, and the sample is either muted or barely audible. So that's how much I like just triggering the samples. Now the other thing is, let's just go to one of these Grace ones. Let's have a listen. This one looks pretty strong. So let's have a listen to this Grace one that I created. And let's send, that's good. And let's send the verb to that as well. So there's a more uniform snare sound. Let's have a listen. Bring it down. Now, there's moments in this, I'll be honest, that I don't like the feel of that much. There's a couple of moments where he's a little wonky. Let's have a listen here. And this is all part of the process. When you're mixing, you're doing a lot. These days, if you have to tune a vocal, you tune a vocal. You want this mix to sound amazing. So here, let's have a listen. It's pretty sloppy, and I don't know if I can let that go. So I'm in drum group all, and this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to tab to transient. In Pro Tools, it's tab to transient. It's just tab. I'm going to hit the transient here. I'm going to hit B to cut it. And I'm just going to cut it generically here for the time being. And then I'm going to hit Command 0, and that's going to snap it to where it should be on the grid. You don't have to grid everything, but in this particular instance, I want to. Now, again, look at this transient here. It sounds horrible when I listen. It just sounds sloppy. So I'm just going to highlight that region. I did a cut with B, and now I'm going to Command 0 and snapping it back. Let's have a listen. See how that feels now. Yeah, it's pretty horrible because of the hi-hat. So it's really a combination. But so here we're going to go now. I'm going to cut this hi-hat. So I just tab to transient. I hit B, cut. Now I'm going to get Command 0. Put it back in. I'm going to go to my trim tool and put all of this in. Now let's have a listen. Now there's a couple of other moments that are stumbling around a little bit because here he's getting a little happy. So let's just let's be careful that we don't grid the whatever out of it. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to highlight the section. What I do is I'll do it slowly. I highlight the front of this, but I'm not going in too hard to the front of the transient because I don't want to ruin everything completely. So I highlight it. I hold down Shift and I go up to this next area here. And now I take my hand off and I go CV, which is copy paste, and that just cuts it out. And then I hit Command 0. If you see here, it's already just a little bit too much in front for me. So now I'm going to cut it again and just drag it back a little bit. And just See, I'm doing subtle movements here. You might think I'm being too subtle. Let's have a listen before we put fades in. And see that last one there just is a little too much behind for me. Don't want to cut here. You see where the overheads are? CV, cut, move it forward. I'm actually going to trim the front again. So you see what I'm doing is when I'm editing it, I'm not necessarily going to the front of the transient when I don't want it to be exactly on a grid. I'm just pulling it forward a little bit because it sounds too sloppy for me. Sloppy's good, but there's good sloppy and bad sloppy. So now let's just clean up the edit point on all of these. So you go to the front of that transient down there, and you can do a number of things. You could batch fade, or you can go through individual fades. What I do is I will highlight a region. I'll open up in Pro Tools my Beat Detective, go to Edit Smoothing Only, and just hit Fill and Crossfade here, and then hit Smooth. It says it already has a crossfade in it, so what I'll do quickly is I'll go to Edit, Fades, delete existing fades and redo them. It's a quick and easy way, rather than spending 5 minutes searching for them. Just redo the fade, and Bob's your uncle. Now let's have a listen. Now it's, it's not perfect, but it feels a lot better. And that's part of the process. If you're mixing somebody else's stuff and, you don't want to go through and edit every single hit of everything, because once you edit the drums ridiculously to a track that's been tracked, already recorded, you're going to end up editing the bass and then re-editing the guitars. And then even the vocal feels out. But within itself there, you could feel the hi-hat and particularly the grace notes were just kind of like sloppy and pulling back. So I had the ability there to just move those little things without moving the main kicks and snares, because everything was cut to those, and it just feels better. So that's part of your job. It really is. Now, I'm going to set up, you can do multiple things. I'm going to set up a separate kick reverb. Now, you could use the same one because I'm going to use the same size. However, it's easier for me to have a bus, an auxiliary, that has just the reverb from one instrument on it than multiple things going to it, because when I want to quickly turn up the snare, for instance, which I'm going to, the snare reverb in the choruses, I'm going to maybe turn it up 1.5 dB. I don't want to bring up the kick reverb necessarily. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. Maybe it only wants to come up 0.5 dB, and then I'm adjusting the sends going into the return of the verb. It gets really complicated. So I'm going to do the same thing I did with the snare, and we're going to listen and audition the kicks. It's pretty dry, great sounding kick. That's just all click. That's something we'll push up in the choruses. You'll see that in a minute. That's kind of a sloppy kick. Feels like the beat is kind of flip on the front. So I'm not going to use that. So we're going to use our first one here. Okay, so that's going to be our kick. So let's create a new sub. Again, if you're in your DAW, happens to be Pro Tools, Shift, Command, N, Command, right hand arrow, bottom arrow down. There we go, stereo auxiliary created. Try and keep them where all your drums are, so when you're scrolling through your session, your verb for your snare is near your snare. Your verb for your kick is near them. That's just the way I work. Some people put all of their effects in one big blob. I find that a little complicated for my brain. However, you might be different. I personally keep it near where I'm working. Okay, so let's be pedantic. Let's call it kick, verb. And I am going to use the same verb. I'm also going to pull across the compressor. I am using Option in Pro Tools, and I'm dragging and dropping it like that, and it keeps it and copies and pastes it. Same thing with the verb. I'm going to turn the compressor off for a second, just so I can have a listen. And I'm going to create a new bus, 7 and 8 for the kick. It's a stereo file, it's pan stereo, so there's a little bit of ambient, so I'm going to keep the send stereo as well, 7 and 8. Let's hit, if I hit Option on the fader there, it goes straight to 0. Let's have a listen. It's nice. Cool, let's turn on a compressor. Doesn't need to be quite so much. Nice though. Let's bring all our drums in. I have such a critical ear. I'm listening to this and I'm seeing some stuff I don't like, hearing some stuff I don't like. There's a flam going on in there in those kicks. Did you hear that? So when our samples were put in, something didn't quite work there. So I could hear it was horrible. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to tab to transient, do an Apple B. I'm going to highlight C and V, and I'm going to drag that back in time, like so. Just got to be vigilant for this kind of stuff. This is what happens sometimes when you're putting samples in. You get these issues. Let's have a listen. Nice. So there's all kinds of timing issues here. This is dragged and late, but it kind of feels good. I'm not going to edit something until it sounds bad. I don't just edit the drums for the heck of it. As you can see, there's some sloppiness, and sometimes it sounds great and sometimes it doesn't. And I've got to be aware that instruments were cut to these drums. So if I edit things heavily, I might completely destroy that. That's a little sloppy for me. I'm going to let it go until we hear everything together. So far, this is our drum sound. A little bit too much verb on those grace notes for me. You can probably hear that yourselves. Let's go back and hear them again. Cool. They're also still a little mid-rangey for me. Not too bad. But I'm just going to boost a little. You know what? I'm going to take my slope here and even out. See what I'm doing here? You can do it in all different ways with different plugins, but you see I'm just starting to catch a little bit more gentle slope on that top end, and then I'm going to boost it more. Let's just have a listen to just that drum on its own. Take the verb off. I hear a little bit more bottom snare now. I'm getting a little aggressive. So that's quite a lot of EQ. Now I'm going to copy that over to the other one so there's no phasing. And again, we could bust that together, but I'm not. There you go. You know, I'm going to swap this over and see what it sounds like with the verb being triggered from the more bottom snare sounding one. See all the drums together. I much prefer that. That to me is working much better now. So it's just about, you can see, I can tell from the bleed in my microphone, I'm working at super low volumes here so I can hear evenly. There's one hit I missed on these drums here that still feels a little weird. Our hat is good, so it's really just this one grace note that's just a little bit too ahead. Tab to transient, highlight a region here, CV, Command 0, we'll put it back on the grid. Doesn't necessarily have to be on the grid, and the way I adjust that is by where I choose to cut it. Let's have a listen before I put a fade in. And the other one is just too late here. So one was super early and one super late. So let's just make a cut here. Have a quick listen. Go back a bar or two so you can hear. Great. Okay. Highlight the region, Command 8 for those of you using Pro Tools. Go to Edit Smoothing, highlight it here, hit Smooth, and that's a quick and easy way to put my fades in. Great. Okay, so there we go. Now we have a pretty live sounding drum kit. Still a little hot on these grace notes. Sounds a little bit more natural. When I want them to be in there, but I don't want them to sound like they're this exact part, you know, where it's going, it's not that, it should be just kind of felt. Okay, so we've got our drums somewhat in a place now where I can listen to other instruments. It's not as slamming as it could be in some instances, but I don't know what I'm up for yet until I hear other instruments. Now, overheads are definitely a little hot. See how I am? That one kick is just killing me there. It's just far too late for me. So I'm back in all. See how I am? I say don't edit, but if something is just not working, it's not working. Okay, I'm gonna look. You see the hi-hat? It's super late as well. So I'm going to highlight right up until there. Let's go down to... what that is that's a little grace note snare. So let's get that now. It's pretty tough. You see what it's doing is creating huge gaps. You might hear that edit quite heavily. So I'm going to put a little bit more length on the front there and split the difference. So that the edit, because sometimes if you get crazy on these edits, you can really hear them. If you pull back something and you're creating such a huge gap, you'll get like a double ring on a snare. And you definitely don't want that. If the snare is like, the second half of the snare is appearing twice, you're going to get this kind of go, go. Instead of getting a dong, you get a dong. So you've got to be careful with the edits. So sometimes it's best to sort of like move it, tug it towards where you want it to be, as opposed to putting it exactly where it is, and then it sounds terrible. Yeah, that's fine for me. There's sometimes where something is so far out, like if it means that the bass note now is slightly too far behind, I'll push it forward. That's right in a chorus, so I need that groove to keep going. Some of the bright stuff, the 3 to 5K range, that's where your ears are most sensitive, and there's a lot of that in the hat. Like, let's see what I did with the hat. Yeah, I mean, I did a boost there, which is probably too much.
You know, he's in touch with this feminine side.
And ultimately, it's just too loud.
Leaving a trail.
So I'm just going to take the output on this channel a little bit. I said a little bit, I'm going to take it down like 2 dB. 2.4.
He's fun and psychotic. Let me unleash, he said. Let me unleash.
Much better.